The evening air in St. Mary Mead carried a strange stillness, as though the hedgerows themselves were listening. News had spread quickly. Something dreadful had happened at Bantry House. The grand estate of Lady Bantry, widow of a long line of minor aristocrats, was rarely mentioned beyond her charity teas and the occasional garden fete. Tonight, however, it was the scene of something that did not fit within the parish's accustomed rhythm. The library door had been found locked from the inside, yet when it was forced open by the butler and the local constable, they discovered a young man sprawled lifeless upon the carpet. He was unfamiliar to nearly everyone present, dressed not as a servant or tradesman, but in a well-made suit, faintly dusty from travel. The cause of death was not immediately apparent. There was no knife, no blood, no sign of struggle. On the small table by his hand rested a faded envelope, addressed in a looping feminine script to "My son." Inside it was not a letter, but a pressed violet, brittle with age. The flower seemed so absurdly out of place that some dismissed it as a trick of the dead man's own sentimentality. Others whispered of secrets Lady Bantry had long kept buried. Inspector Craddock, summoned from Melchester, examined the locked door and the windows fastened with iron latches. No tool marks, no forced entry. The servants insisted no one had left or entered during the hours in question. The library had been shuttered for most of the afternoon. And yet, here lay the body of a man who had walked in unseen and apparently perished without cause. Craddock was not the sort to indulge in superstition, but the absence of a rational explanation irked him visibly. His questions, sharp and precise, only produced vague replies. The butler swore he had checked the room earlier and found it empty. Lady Bantry, pale beneath her pearls, murmured that she had never laid eyes on the young man before. Miss Marple, who had arrived with some homemade seed cake for Lady Bantry that very afternoon, listened quietly to the talk, her small blue eyes flicking from one speaker to another. She had not been invited to the house for scandal, but for companionship, though scandal had greeted her instead. She bent to look at the envelope, her gloved hands careful not to disturb it. A violet pressed. "Long ago," she said softly as if to herself. "Curious. One would not carry such a thing unless it meant something very particular. And to find it here, why should it appear now, of all times?" The villagers soon crowded the gates, inventing explanations in hushed tones. Some spoke of a secret liaison. Others recalled Lady Bantry's youth, when rumours swirled of a distant romance across the sea. The word heir slipped into the gossip more than once, though no one could say why with certainty. Craddock scowled at such chatter. He preferred evidence, yet all he had was a locked room, a dead stranger, and a flower that crumbled at the edges of touch. The coroner, when he arrived, found no obvious wounds. Poison was considered, but the man's lips showed no trace of it. There was, however, a peculiar discoloration at the base of the throat, faint but undeniable, as though something invisible had stolen his breath. The medical verdict would not. Be swift. Meanwhile, Lady Bantry retired to her chambers, trembling as though she feared something far beyond the disgrace of scandal. Her maid whispered of a box kept locked in her ladyship's writing desk, never opened in years, but too many eyes were watching for her to dare investigate further. Miss Marple, lingering in the drawing-room, knitted quietly, as if her needles might click the truth into being. She had lived long enough to know that crimes which appear unsolvable are often those in which the solution hides not in the strangeness, but in the ordinariness overlooked. She watched Craddock pace, his irritation growing. She watched the servants, their unease mounting under suspicion. Most of all, she watched the window panes darkening with the fall of night, the house folding itself into silence as though protecting an old wound. What unsettled her most was not the dead man himself, but the reaction of Lady Bantry when she had first seen him. There had been a moment, not grief, not fear, but recognition flickering across her face, swiftly masked by the genteel calm expected of her station. Miss Marple filed this away. Recognition was the first step toward motive, and motive always led to method, no matter how impossible the circumstances seemed. The villagers would continue to speculate, the inspector would continue to measure angles and locks. But Miss Marple already sensed that the violet was no accident. It was not a clue in the crude sense, but a message, one that tied the dead stranger to Lady Bantry herself, and perhaps to a truth she had long sought to conceal. Somewhere between the locked library door and the brittle flower lay a secret, so carefully kept it had cost a man his life. The old lady's needles clicked on, soft and steady, as though they alone could hold the pattern until it was ready to be revealed. Inspector Craddock believed in order. His men measured the angles of the library windows, inspected the hinges of the heavy oak door, dusted the locks for prints that would never quite be distinct enough to matter. Statements were taken down in neat columns. The body was removed, discreetly, leaving only the outline of where the carpet pile had flattened under his weight. To an outsider, it might have seemed the machinery of law was grinding smoothly toward its inevitable conclusion, but those who knew Miss Marple could see she did not put her faith in machinery. She put it in people. She stood small and still. In the drawing room, a figure no one thought to challenge because she seemed so harmless, but her eyes, sharp as glass needles, noted everything. The inspector questioned Lady Bantry in tones designed to reassure, yet Miss Marple caught the way the older woman's hands twisted the hem of her sleeve under the table, unseen but not unnoticed. A widow who had faced county gossip for years would not tremble so easily unless the tremor was born of something deeper than the shock of an intruder's death. The butler, Pritchard, gave his account, how he had knocked on the library door to announce tea and received no answer. When he returned an hour later and still heard nothing, he grew alarmed, fetched the footman, and together they forced the door. He recited the facts precisely, but Miss Marple caught his quick glance at Lady Bantry when he spoke of the first. Knocking. It was the sort of glance one gives when confirming a detail one has been instructed not to vary. The inspector's pencil did not hesitate, but Miss Marple's knitting needles slowed as though they tugged at that small loop of doubt. Then there was the curious matter of the key. When the library door was forced, the key had been found still, in the lock on the inside. If the young man had locked himself in, why no trace of fear on his features? He lay as if merely surprised by the interruption of death, his hand still touching the arm of the chair, and if someone else had locked him in, then how had they left? The windows were bolted tight. Craddock muttered about secret passages, but Miss Marple had lived long enough in country houses to know that most supposed hidden doors led only to broom cupboards or draughts. She asked very gently whether anyone had noticed a cushion displaced on the settee by the fire. The inspector frowned. What of it? But Marple leaned closer. Dust, she murmured. There is a square upon the seat where something heavy rested until very lately. Cushions do not move themselves. She said no more, for she disliked being thought to instruct policemen, but the point lodged itself like a thorn. The maid, Elsie, was summoned. She curtsied clumsily, hands raw from polishing. She declared she had never seen the dead man before. Yet when Miss Marple asked, so innocently, whether he had come by motor car or on foot, Elsie's eyes flickered with unease. I couldn't. Say, miss, she stammered. No one had asked about a motor car. No one but Elsie had reason to know. That slip was tucked away in Miss Marple's quiet mind. The peculiar envelope, too, invited scrutiny. Inspector Craddock had treated it as a sentimental trinket. But Miss Marple studied the ink, faded to a sepia brown, the edges worn smooth. A hand from 30 years ago, at least, she remarked. One might almost believe it belonged to Lady Bantry herself, when she was scarcely more than a girl. Lady Bantry's teacup rattled faintly in its saucer. Though her lips pressed in a smile of denial, the villagers outside the gates clamoured for answers. Inside, the house was tight with silence. The footman swore he had seen a stranger lingering, near the hedgerow earlier that day, but when pressed could not decide whether it was the dead man or another entirely. Contradictions multiplied like shadows at twilight. Miss Marple walked softly to the mantelpiece. There, amid the polished silver frames of hunting parties and garden fetes, stood a single photograph in a plain wooden case, half turned from view. She straightened it delicately. The portrait showed Lady Bantry in youth beside a tall, dark-haired man with the same set of jaw as the dead stranger. The likeness was not perfect, but strong enough that Miss Marple did not doubt its meaning. Yet no one mentioned the photograph. Neither the inspector, nor the servants seemed willing to acknowledge it. When Miss Marple set it quietly back in place, Lady Bantry's eyes followed her with a look that pleaded and warned all at once. The first threads of deception were now visible. A dead man locked in a room where he could not have locked himself. A flower preserved far beyond its natural span. A maid who spoke too quickly. A portrait turned discreetly away. Each thread alone might unravel into nothing, but together they suggested a tapestry of secrets, long buried beneath the respectable hush of Bantry House. Miss Marple smiled her mild smile and resumed her knitting. She would not yet speak her suspicions aloud. It was far too early. But she had already begun to see that the case was not about how the young man died. That would come with patience and science. The real question, the one that mattered, was why he had come here at all and what claim he might have laid upon Lady Bantry's life had he lived to speak. The inspector declared he would return in the morning with a fuller staff, determined to account for every servant's movements and search the grounds for evidence of the stranger's arrival. But Miss Marple knew the truth would not be found in the hedges or the gravel paths. It would be found in glances, in pauses, in the way a woman reached to steady her cup, or a maid misremembered a motor car. She had lived her life observing such details, the small betrayals of human nature. And already, within the brittle silence of the Bantry household, those betrayals had begun to show themselves. Inspector Craddock returned the next morning, crisp and formal, with 2 constables at his side. They moved with the assurance of men who believed order could be imposed by checklists and testimony. Statements were taken again, each voice added to the ledger of official record. But Miss Marple, seated quietly with her knitting, understood that truth rarely came from the words themselves. It was in the pauses between them, the hesitations and eagerness, the way one pair of eyes darted too quickly while another lingered too long. The first to be questioned was Pritchard, the butler. He stood stiff as an oak post, hands clasped behind his back. "I found the door locked, sir, just after 4:30. Knocked twice, as is my duty, and when no answer came, I fetched young Arthur to assist me. We forced it, and there he was, lying on the rug, dead as stone." His words were steady, but Miss Marple noticed how carefully he avoided looking at Lady Bantry. And when Craddock pressed him, was he quite certain the room had been empty earlier in the day, the butler swallowed hard before answering yes. It was not a swallow of thirst, but of nerves, as if he had rehearsed the response one time too many. The maid Elsie followed, twisting her apron. She insisted she had never seen the stranger, had no idea how he came to the house. Yet when asked where she had been that afternoon, she stumbled. "In the scullery, sir. Washing up the luncheon dishes, no polishing the silver. Oh, I can't rightly remember." Craddock frowned at her inconsistency, but Miss Marple only glanced down at her knitting, lips pursed. She knew young girls often faltered under questioning, but this was something more. The slip about the motor car the previous night lingered in Miss Marple's mind. Perhaps Elsie had indeed seen how the man arrived, and wished desperately to forget it. Arthur, the footman, entered next. Eager, almost too eager, he described in detail how he had helped force the door, how he had stood back gallantly as the inspector examined the scene. His words tumbled over one another in a rush. "Never seen him before, sir, not a gentleman I'd know. But if you want my opinion, he looked like a foreigner. Dark, you know, and with a kind of look about him." Craddock wrote without comment, but Miss Marple's eyes narrowed. People were rarely so quick to volunteer opinions unless they wished to direct suspicion away from themselves. Arthur's eagerness rang false, like an actor on stage trying too hard to please. Lady Bantry herself was questioned again. She sat upright, pearls gleaming faintly in the morning light. "I have nothing to add, Inspector. The man is a stranger to me. I cannot imagine what business brought him here." Her voice was steady, but her fingers toyed with a handkerchief, knotting and unknotting it in her lap. When Craddock asked whether she could recall any letters or acquaintances from her youth who might connect to the envelope, she froze only for a breath, then shook her head. "No one of significance. My life has been uneventful." Miss Marple caught the flicker of something behind her eyes, fear, perhaps, or memory. Lady Bantry was lying, or at the very least withholding. The villagers were not silent either. Word had spread that a stranger was found dead in the library, and by morning half the parish had invented ties between him and Lady Bantry. Mrs. Price Ridley whispered to anyone who would listen that she had once seen a young man, years ago, speaking with Lady Bantry in the rose garden at dusk. Mrs. Hartnell, with her habitual certainty, insisted the man must have been a blackmailer come to extort the lady. Their voices, though loud, added more smoke than clarity. Yet Miss Marple listened, because even smoke may drift from the right fire. When the gardener, old Briggs, was called in, he scratched his head beneath his cap. "Didn't see no stranger, sir, only motor-car tracks at the side gate. Funny thing, though, they led in, but I couldn't find where they led out again." This was noted, then overlooked. But Miss Marple's needles clicked faster. She remembered Elsie's slip about the motor-car. That thread, once pulled, would unravel more than one story. Later, in the hush of the drawing-room, Miss Marple quietly asked the housemaid Gladys, brought in from the kitchen, what she thought of the whole business. Gladys, younger and less guarded than Elsie, blurted, "I think her ladyship knew him, miss. When she saw his face, she went white as my apron." And then, realizing she had said too much, she flushed and retreated. A contradiction. Lady Bantry insisted the man was a stranger, but even the servants noticed her reaction. Miss Marple stored every detail carefully. The puzzle was not yet complete, but the edges were beginning to form. The butler's careful lies, the maid's fearful slip, the footman's eagerness, Lady Bantry's silence. They were voices of deception, each concealing some part of the truth. The trick would be to separate those who lied from fear of dismissal, from shame, or from the desperate need to bury a scandal. Inspector Craddock left that evening with more statements, but no solution. He muttered that country cases were never as straightforward as they seemed. Miss Marple sat quietly by the fire after he had gone, her knitting folded in her lap. She thought of the pressed violet in the envelope, the photograph half hidden on the mantel, and Lady Bantry's trembling hands. Deception was everywhere, but it was not random. It pointed, if one knew how to read it, towards something very old, very carefully concealed, and if the dead man had come here to claim what was his, then someone had silenced him before he could speak. Inspector Craddock returned with renewed determination, his notebook already thick with contradictions. He had servants' statements, Lady Bantry's denials, and the coroner's preliminary finding. Death by asphyxiation, subtle but deliberate. No poison, no wound, just the quiet taking of breath. That, Craddock declared, could not be an accident. Someone had pressed the life from the young man with deliberate force, yet the locked door still mocked him. How could a murderer leave without leaving? Miss Marple listened while the inspector paced. She never hurried her thoughts. Instead, she let them knit together, like the wool between her needles, looping one clue to the next. What she saw was not a single motive, but a tangle of them, knotted and overlapping, a maze where every turn revealed a different shadow. The butler Pritchard had perhaps the simplest motive of all: fear. His position depended entirely upon Lady Bantry's household remaining respectable. Should a scandal erupt, a dead stranger tied by whispers to her ladyship's past, then servants might be dismissed without reference. His nervous swallow, his practiced testimony, all suggested a man protecting his own survival. Could fear drive him to murder? Perhaps. Yet Miss Marple doubted he had the physical strength to smother a young man silently in the space of a few minutes. Elsie, the maid, was another knot in the maze. Her slip about the motor car, her trembling under questions, these pointed not to guilt, but to knowledge. She had seen something she dared not reveal. Perhaps she feared implicating herself, or perhaps she had been warned to keep silent. Fear again, but not the same kind. Hers was the fear of a girl caught between duty and danger, not of one who had killed. Arthur, the footman, painted himself in suspicious eagerness, too ready to call the stranger a foreigner, too quick to proclaim his ignorance. Eagerness could be a mask for guilt. It could also be resentment. Arthur had once boasted in the village about inheriting nothing but debts from his father, a bitterness that often surfaced in drink. What if the dead man had promised him something, or threatened him? Could jealousy or revenge play their part here? Yet Arthur's alibi was firm. He had been seen carrying coal scuttles at the very time the coroner fixed the death. Unless the witnesses lied for him, his eagerness was that of a man who knew something, but not the killer's something. And then, Lady Bantry. Here lay the heart of the maze, the pressed violet, the hidden photograph, the look of recognition. She could not disguise. These whispered of a past entanglement. Perhaps the stranger had been her son, or claimed to be. If true, the shame of it would ruin her in county circles. Was that enough to drive her to smother him? Miss Marple thought not. Lady Bantry was not a woman of violence. She was, however, a woman of pride, and pride could be just as dangerous. Had she concealed a letter, destroyed a confession, protected her reputation at the cost of truth? The motive of fear tangled with the motive of pride, weaving a net tighter than any rope. The Gardner Briggs added yet another strand, greed. Motorcar tracks that entered but did not leave suggested someone had hidden the vehicle. If the young man had carried valuables or money, perhaps Briggs or another had sought to profit. Yet the dead man's pockets held little more than the faded envelope and a small watch of no great worth. Greed alone could not explain his death, unless it was greed of a different kind, the inheritance of land or title, the claim of blood. If the stranger was indeed an heir, then his presence threatened the positions of many. Miss Marple sat with these motives turning in her mind. Greed, fear, jealousy, pride, revenge. Each suspect had a reason, yet none fit the whole. The crime remained unsolvable if viewed as one person's act alone. But what if it was not one? What if each deception concealed not a murderer, but a participant in silence, complicit in a greater web? That thought glimmered like a thread of silver among the dark wool. She asked very gently whether Lady Bantry's late husband had ever travelled abroad. The answer came with hesitation. Yes, he had spent time in South America in his youth, before my marriage, of course. Miss Marple nodded, her eyes resting on the photograph again. The resemblance was too close to ignore. A child born abroad unacknowledged, grown now into a man who had come to claim his right. That explained the envelope, the violet, tokens of a love that had existed before propriety sealed the gates. It explained Lady Bantry's tremor of recognition. But if the man was indeed an heir, then his death meant someone else had more to lose than she had to gain. The inspector, impatient with theories, pressed again for practicalities. Who had last seen the stranger alive? No one admitted it. Who had touched the key? No one dared confess. Each alibi overlapped, each denial contradicted another. Arthur swore Elsie was in the kitchen all afternoon, but Elsie insisted she had been in the scullery unseen. Pritchard claimed he alone knocked on the library door, but the gardener muttered he had seen someone crossing the corridor near that time. Lady Bantry swore she had rested in her chamber, yet her maid confessed she had not been there the whole hour. The maze grew denser with every step. Through it all, Miss Marple's quiet presence unsettled them more than the inspector's authority. She said little, asked only the smallest of questions, but each left a mark. When she inquired whether the fire had been lit in the library that afternoon, Arthur flushed. When she wondered aloud if violets grew in the Bantry gardens, Elsie dropped her duster. When she remarked that love affairs from youth often had long shadows, Lady Bantry paled. Every motive stirred, every alibi frayed. The inspector concluded the day with frustration. They're all hiding something, confound it. But which one would kill? Miss Marple folded her knitting with a small secret smile. She had begun to see that the answer was not in asking who, but why all of them lied at once. The maze of motives was not a tangle by chance. It was the natural overgrowth of one root, buried deep in Lady Bantry's past. And the dead man, whoever he truly was, had stepped directly into its shadow. Inspector Craddock prided himself on method, and at last, after days of trudging interviews and sleepless hours comparing notes, he believed method had borne fruit. The breakthrough came from a small gleaming object, found beneath the library settee during a second, more thorough search, a monogrammed cigarette case, engraved with the letters A.B. It did not belong to Lady Bantry, nor to any of her household. But Arthur, the footman, when pressed, turned crimson and stammered that yes, it was his. The case seemed damning. Arthur admitted he had smoked in the library once or twice against strict orders, but he swore he had never left his case behind. On that fateful afternoon, his words only tangled him deeper. For the inspector, the matter seemed nearly resolved. The cigarette case, the eagerness to declare the dead man a foreigner, the inconsistencies in his story, together they formed a chain of suspicion neat enough to satisfy both report and superior. Arthur was taken aside, questioned again under sterner tones. At last he confessed that he had indeed seen the stranger. He claimed the man had demanded to wait in the library, insisting he had business with Lady Bantry. When Arthur hesitated, the man threatened him with dismissal, saying he knew secrets that could ruin the household. Frightened, Arthur left him there. He swore he never returned until the body was found. His confession, however muddled, seemed to place him squarely in the heart of the crime. Craddock announced with grim certainty that the matter was nearly solved. A servant, jealous or desperate, confronted a stranger who sought entry into secrets above his station. A quarrel ensued, violence followed, and the locked door was an afterthought, a panicked attempt to stage impossibility. Motive, fear of exposure. Means, brute force. Opportunity, undeniable. The village hummed with satisfaction. "It's always the servants," said Mrs. Price Ridley with relish at the grocer's. "Young men with no breeding, bound to turn violent when cornered." The gossip spread quickly, sealing Arthur's guilt in the parish imagination. The inspector's men were dispatched to collect further proof, convinced only details remained. Yet Miss Marple sat by the window of the Bantry drawing-room, her needles motionless in her lap, eyes resting on the autumn light falling across the lawn. Something in the tale refused to settle into place. Arthur was foolish, yes, eager to please, quick to stumble. But she had watched his clumsy honesty when he was frightened and his affected bravado when he felt cornered. This confession bore the marks of a story nudged into shape, not truth spoken freely. And the cigarette case, that was too neat, too pat. A thing planted, perhaps, where it would gleam like bait beneath the settee. She remembered the cushion displaced, the dust showing an object had once rested there. She remembered Elsie's slip about a motor car. And above all, she remembered Lady Bantry's face when she first saw the dead man. Arthur was not the one who trembled then. That evening, Craddock allowed himself a rare air of triumph. "We've got him, Miss Marple," he declared. "The case will go before the magistrate. He'll break fully before the week is out." Miss Marple smiled politely. "How very efficient, Inspector. And yet, you do recall that Arthur is not a strong young man. A good boy, but not sturdy. To smother another grown man silently, without noise or struggle, that would require, what shall I say, its considerable determination. Do you not think?" Craddock frowned through. She knew that back, something buried in village memory. Years ago, before the war, there had been whispers of Lady Bantry's travels abroad. She had spent a season in South America, ostensibly for her health, but tongues in St. Mary Mead had wagged. A romance, perhaps, nothing confirmed, soon forgotten as propriety demanded. Miss Marple herself had heard the gossip while pouring tea at the Women's Institute, and like so many of life's trifles, it had lodged quietly in her mind. Now it returned with startling clarity. If Lady Bantry had once known that man, perhaps, even loved him, then the stranger's arrival at Bantry House was no accident. The pressed violet in the envelope, the affectionate salutation of "my son," these were relics of a long-concealed truth. The dead man might well have been the product of that vanished romance, come back to claim acknowledgement, or perhaps even inheritance. Miss Marple, careful as ever, did not confront Lady Bantry outright. Instead, she sat beside her in the drawing room that afternoon, the knitting needles clicking softly, and remarked, "It is curious how people and places have such long memories. Why, only last week I was telling young Dr. Haydock that events 30 years ago often reach into the present, quite unexpectedly." Lady Bantry flinched as though struck. She sipped her tea, but her hand trembled against the cup. "The past," she said, "is best left where it belongs." "Ah," murmured Miss Marple, "but the past has a habit of returning, especially when it has been buried but not forgotten." That evening, Elsie the maid was found crying in the scullery. When Miss Marple asked why, the girl confessed in a rush that she had seen Lady Bantry speaking to the stranger in the rose garden the day before his death. "I called her mother, miss, I heard it plain, and she begged him to leave before anyone else could see." Elsie sobbed, terrified of losing her position if the truth were known. Miss Marple soothed her gently, then considered the weight of this confession. It confirmed what the photograph and the violet already suggested. The stranger was Lady Bantry's son, unacknowledged, long hidden from society's eyes. His presence at Bantry House had not been intrusion but claim. Her claim someone could not allow him to make. The inspector, when told of Elsie's tale, grew grave. If that's true, then motive expands, not narrows. Anyone tied to the Bantry estate might have reason to see him gone. Inheritance, scandal, disgrace, Lord knows what else. He muttered darkly that Lady Bantry herself was not above suspicion. But Miss Marple shook her head. Pride and fear might drive a woman to silence, but not to murder. There was another hand at work. The next day brought yet another thread. Old Briggs, the gardener, recalled that years ago, before Lady Bantry's marriage, he had seen a dark-haired man visiting the estate secretly. "He gave her violets, miss," Briggs said, scratching his head. "Always violets. Said they was her favourite." The pressed flower in the envelope was suddenly no longer an oddity, but a symbol of a love affair that had never truly ended, of a past now haunting the present. Piece by piece, the hidden connections emerged. Lady Bantry and the stranger's father. The stranger himself grown into a man who sought his mother's recognition, the servants who knew fragments, each concealing them for fear or loyalty, and beneath it all the estate itself, a prize worth protecting. If the stranger were acknowledged, what might he inherit? What might others lose? Greed, fear, jealousy, revenge, they all lay tangled in that possibility. Miss Marple saw now that the crime was not about a single quarrel in a locked room. It was the culmination of 30 years of silence, secrecy, and buried scandal. The dead man had not simply walked into Bantry House by chance. He had been drawn back by the shadow of his own past, and someone in the household had ensured that shadow never rose into daylight. The inspector believed his case nearly closed with Arthur. The villagers fed on gossip of impropriety. But Miss Marple, with her clear, sharp eyes, saw deeper. This was not about a servant's folly. It was about bloodlines and legacies, about the lengths to which people would go to protect their place in society. And the hand that had pressed the breath from the young man was guided not by desperation alone, but by a long, cold intention rooted in a past no one wished spoken. As she folded her knitting away that night, Miss Marple knew the next step would not be to press the servants further, nor to hunt for more cigarette cases. It would be to unearth the full truth of Lady Bantry's hidden heir, and to discover who among those gathered at Bantry House had most to lose from his rightful claim. The case had settled into uneasy stasis. Inspector Craddock pressed his theory of Arthur's guilt with increasing stubbornness, while Lady Bantry retreated into silence, and the servants moved about the house with downcast eyes. Yet the air in Bantry House was not one of resolution, but of waiting for something unspoken to surface. Miss Marple felt it in her bones. Crimes, she knew, had a rhythm of their own. This one was still moving toward its true crescendo. That night, the household was tense. The servants locked their doors. Lady Bantry refused supper. Even Briggs the gardener claimed he saw lantern light moving among the trees, though when checked, nothing was found. Fear spread like a draught through old corridors. Everyone wondered who might be next, silenced. Miss Marple, sitting quietly by the fire, allowed her thoughts to knit themselves together. "You see," she told Inspector Craddock in her soft, reasonable tone, "whoever removed those things has shown us something far more important than the objects themselves." "And what's that?" he asked grimly. "That they matter," Miss Marple replied. "People do not burn old flowers or hide old photos. Later that day, while the inspector questioned Briggs the gardener yet again, Miss Marple settled by the hearth with her knitting and watched the others move about. She noted how Pritchard, the butler, polished the silver with almost obsessive care. She watched how he turned every object back to its exact place, never leaving a frame crooked or a glass out of line. And then it struck her, the photograph in the plain wooden frame, the one now vanished. She remembered clearly. It had been turned slightly aside, unlike the others. That was the one detail in the room out of pattern. And Pritchard, a man who never allowed such disorder, had left it that way. Why? Unless he wanted it to be noticed, and later, when he realized what danger it posed, he removed it entirely. The thought pricked sharply at her. All along, the crime had seemed baffling because it lacked coherence, too many motives, too many lies. But suddenly, the threads began to knot into shape. A man arrives claiming to be Lady Bantry's son. Evidence of that claim, the violet, the photograph, both vanish. The witness who overhears him call her mother, attacked. The servant who stumbles too close to suspicion, murdered. Each act was not random, but deliberate pruning. The murderer was not trying to confuse the case. He was trying to erase one story and replace it with another. That night, Miss Marple deliberately steered conversation at supper toward memories of the old Bantry estate. She asked Briggs about the gardens, Lady Bantry about her husband's travels, Pritchard about his long service. Each answered, but only Pritchard stiffened when she spoke of the South American violets once grown in the conservatory. His denial came too swiftly. "Never saw such a thing, madam. Only common English flowers here." Yet Miss Marple remembered clearly Briggs mentioning them years ago, given as gifts by a dark-haired visitor. That false note was the final confirmation she sought. Later, in the drawing room, she spoke softly to Inspector Craddock. "Do you see it now, Inspector? It has been before us all along. The attacks, the vanished things, the violence, all of... It follows a pattern of concealment. Someone is not trying to reveal a crime but to bury a lineage. The man who died was not a stranger. He was Lady Bantry's son. And the murderer is the one who had the most to lose if such a truth became known." Craddock frowned, slow to follow. "You mean her ladyship herself?" Miss Marple shook her head gently. "No. Pride might lead her to silence, yes, but never to smother her own child. No, Inspector. Think instead of who would be disinherited, whose security would vanish if a secret heir claimed his right, who has stood guard over this house for years, more fiercely than any blood relation." The inspector's eyes widened as the pattern unfolded before him. "Pritchard." "Just so," Miss Marple said. "A manservant, yes, but more than that, keeper of her household, guardian of its order. His loyalty is not to Lady Bantry as a woman, but to the estate itself. He would see any threat destroyed, even if it wore the face of a rightful son. That is why the photograph was turned, then stolen. Why the violet disappeared. Why Arthur was silenced. Pritchard has been sweeping the hearth clean of every trace that points to the truth. He believes himself the last defender of Bantry House." The realization settled heavily between them. The crimes, once scattered like fallen leaves, now lay in a discernible pattern. The locked room, the missing relics, the targeted silencing of witnesses, it was no longer chaos, but a design. Miss Marple's knitting needles clicked softly as she concluded, "It is always the same, Inspector. People imagine murder springs from passion or greed, but most often it is from habit, the habit of control, the desire to keep life in perfect order. Pritchard could not allow this house to fall into another's hands, so he has scrubbed away the past as though it were dust upon the silver. Only dust returns. It always does." For the first time since the case began, the inspector felt they were not groping in darkness but following a path. The pattern had emerged, clear and undeniable. Yet one truth lingered like a chill. Pritchard, methodical and precise, would not give himself up easily. He had killed to keep the past buried, and he would kill again before he let it surface. Even after the pattern emerged, the heart of it still lay hidden, like the root of a weed beneath tidy soil. Inspector Craddock, heavy with suspicion now fixed upon Pritchard, wanted to seize him at once, but Miss Marple urged patience. "You see, Inspector," she said softly, It is one thing to point to a man's actions. It is quite another to understand why. Without the why, there is no proof, only conjecture, and men like Pritchard do not break for conjecture. So they watched, they waited, and as they did, the truth began to seep into view, not through evidence of possessions or timetables, but through something deeper, through the man's own nature. Pritchard continued his duties with his usual severity, gliding noiselessly through corridors, ensuring silver gleamed, fires burned evenly, and trays never wobbled in the hand. Outwardly he seemed composed, untouched by the upheaval. Yet Miss Marple noticed the smallest cracks. He lingered too long, in the library, staring at the empty mantel where the photograph once stood. He polished the banisters with unnecessary force, as though scrubbing away invisible stains. And once, when Lady Bantry spoke sharply to him at table, he flinched with a look not of irritation, but of wounded devotion. It was that flinch that set Miss Marple's thoughts alight. For years she had observed the peculiar loyalties of old. Servants, how devotion to a household could eclipse devotion to the people within it. Yet here was something stranger, fiercer. This was not loyalty to duty alone, it was possessiveness. She tested her suspicion with a remark one evening, delivered in her most casual tone. "It must be such a comfort to Lady Bantry," she said, "to know she has always been in such capable hands. Why, I dare say you have been more a guardian than a servant, Mr. Pritchard." The butler's face darkened, though he inclined his head stiffly. "I have done my duty, madam, as always." "But—" Miss Marple's keen eyes did not miss the flush that rose to his temples, nor the way his hand tightened upon the silver salver he carried. The reaction was too intense for mere pride. It was jealousy. That night she laid out her thoughts to Craddock. "You see, Inspector, the motive is not inheritance, not truly. Money and land are but shadows here. What matters is the house itself, the Bantry name, the Bantry bloodline. Pritchard has devoted his life to preserving its sanctity. The stranger's arrival threatened not only scandal, but the intrusion of another man's claim. For Pritchard, it was not only dangerous, it was intolerable." Craddock frowned. "So he killed to protect his lady's reputation?" "No," Miss Marple said gently, "to protect her from herself. That is the difference. In his eyes, Lady Bantry betrayed the house long ago, when she gave her heart elsewhere. Pritchard has spent 30 years guarding her secret, polishing over the cracks, ensuring no whisper escaped. And when the fruit of that past came walking into these halls, he saw not a man but a trespasser. He struck him down with the same precision he might use to snuff a candle, quietly, efficiently, without disturbance. He believes he has saved her, and saved the house. He does not think of it as murder. He thinks of it as loyalty." Craddock shook his head. "Twisted loyalty, more like." "Ah," said Miss Marple, "but that is what makes it so very dangerous." The deeper truth emerged piece by piece. Pritchard's entire life had been one of silent control. He had been a boy, in service before Lady Bantry's marriage, groomed into the household, watching its every triumph and disgrace. He had seen her fall in love with a man unfit for her station. He had watched her return from abroad, pale but composed, with whispers chasing her heels. And he had decided, in that moment, that he alone would be the custodian of Bantry honor. Every act since, the silenced servants, the vanished evidence, the careful denial, had been born from that original vow. When Arthur stumbled too close, when Elsie overheard too much, Pritchard acted with the same cold resolve. He was not protecting himself, he was protecting what he believed was his to guard. Not land, not jewels, but the idea of Bantry House unsullied. His psychology was that of a zealot, but a domestic zealot, one whose chapel was a dining hall and whose altar was a polished mantle. Miss Marple saw it clearly now. The crime was not about greed or revenge, but about possession disguised as service. "You see, Inspector," she said, "some men worship wealth, others power, but Pritchard worships order. And for the sake of that order, he would see blood spilled, evidence burned, photographs vanished. To him it is all one simple duty." The revelation chilled even the inspector, who had seen darker motives aplenty. But there was something uncanny in Pritchard's calm persistence. To kill for money is vulgar. To kill for pride is tragic. But to kill in the name of loyalty, such loyalty as he believed himself to embody, was a horror all its own. The next step would be to draw him into the open, to make him reveal not just his actions, but his warped reasoning. For once Pritchard declared his devotion as motive, the case would no longer be guesswork, but confession. And Miss Marple, with her quiet patience, was already considering how best to turn his own psychology against him. As she folded her knitting, that night she murmured to herself, "It is always the same. The greatest crimes are not born of hater rain swept across the lawns of Bantry House the evening Miss Marple set her quiet trap." The inspector had grown restless, convinced that Pritchard must be arrested at once. But Miss Marple shook her head. "No, Inspector. If you seize him now, he will remain stone silent as a tomb. Men like Pritchard cannot be forced. They must be allowed to speak, to prove to themselves that their actions were righteous. Only then will the truth emerge." So a small gathering was arranged under the guise of formality. Lady Bantry, pale but determined, Elsie still shaken from her attack, Briggs the gardener, and of course Pritchard, who entered the drawing-room with his usual composure, salver in hand. The rain lashed at the windows, thunder muttering far off as if the sky itself wished to listen. Inspector Craddock began stiffly, reviewing the case as though delivering judgment. The stranger, dead in the library, Arthur, found murdered in the orangery. Evidence vanished, witnesses attacked. All within this house, and there is one hand that ties them together. He fixed his gaze upon the butler. Pritchard inclined his head, his expression calm, almost disdainful. "You accuse me, sir?" But before Craddock could answer, Miss Marple's gentle voice slipped into the silence. "Yes, Pritchard. You. And you know why?" She did not raise her tone, nor did she accuse with venom. Instead, she spoke with that calm clarity that always disarmed. The photograph, hidden then removed. The violet taken from the inspector's drawer. Arthur, silenced before he could stumble further. Elsie, attacked because she overheard the word mother. Each act deliberate, precise. Each act yours. Still, he did not move. But his fingers tightened upon the salver until the silver rang faintly. "You believed you were defending Lady Bantry," Miss Marple continued softly. "Defending the honor of this house. You have polished and guarded it for 30 years. Have you not? Guarded it even from her ladyship herself. You thought the stranger a trespasser, an interloper come to spoil the order you preserved." A flicker crossed his face, swift but undeniable. Recognition. Yet he was not a trespasser, she pressed. He was her son, her own blood. And that was what you could not bear. Not scandal, not disgrace, but the thought of another man's claim upon the place you worshipped. You could endure whispers, you could endure gossip, but you could not endure Bantry House itself slipping from your grasp into the hands of a rightful heir. The silence was deep enough to hear the rain against the glass. Lady Bantry's eyes filled with tears, but she did not speak. Craddock shifted, tense, but held his place. Pritchard's voice, when it came, was low and steady. "You do not understand, madam. None of you do. This house is my life, my service, my pride. I gave everything to it when others brought shame. I kept it standing when all else might have crumbled, and I would not. No, I could not. Let a stranger, with a foreign tongue and a claim of blood, tear it from its rightful dignity." His words came faster now, the mask slipping. "I saw him in the library. He demanded recognition, inheritance, a name that was not his to take. Her ladyship might have weakened, yes, I saw it in her eyes. And so I did what had to be done. Quick, quiet, clean. For the house, for her, for all of us." Lady Bantry sobbed into her handkerchief. Craddock's jaw tightened. But Miss Marple, composed as ever, leaned slightly forward. "And Arthur? What of him?" The butler's lips thinned. "He blundered too close, foolish boy. He would have undone everything with his loose tongue, better a clean end than scandal." "And Elsie?" She heard what she should not. "I did not intend her harm. Only silence." At last, the confession hung in the room, heavy and undeniable. Inspector Craddock stepped forward, but Miss Marple lifted her hand. She saw in Pritchard's eyes a last flicker, not of remorse but of desperate pride. Men who kill for gold may surrender, but men who kill for devotion cannot bear humiliation. You see, she said gently, the house is not yours, Pritchard. It never was. You guarded it, yes, you polished it. But you cannot own what belongs to others, no matter how fiercely you clutch it. That is why you killed, because you mistook service for possession. And in doing so, you destroyed the very thing you claimed to protect. Something in her words broke the last thread of his control. He set the salver down with deliberate care, then straightened to his full height. For the first time he looked old, brittle, worn down by his own iron discipline. You are clever, madam, he said quietly. Clever enough to see through me, but tell me this, will the world thank you for it, or will they only whisper and laugh as they always do? I kept them from laughing at her. That was my service. That was my devotion. Craddock's men closed in. Pritchard did not struggle. He only stood, proud even in ruin, as the irons closed on his wrists. Lady Bantry turned away, unable to meet his eyes. Miss Marple folded her knitting, her voice scarcely more than a whisper. Devotion can be the cruelest master of all. The tension ebbed at last, though no one in the room felt relief. The storm outside had spent itself, but Bantry House was quieter than ever, as though mourning not only the lives lost, but the loyalty that had curdled into violence. Inspector. Craddock exhaled and glanced at Miss Marple with reluctant admiration. You had all the pieces from the start, didn't you? Oh no, she said softly. Only the habit of watching. And people, Inspector, are always kind enough to show you the truth if you let them. The storm had passed, leaving Bantry House in the grey quiet of early morning. Pritchard was under guard, his confession taken down in Inspector Craddock's neat hand. Lady Bantry remained in her chambers, too shaken to face the world. The servants moved like shadows, whispering of dismissal and disgrace. For all appearances, the case was finished. The murderer had confessed, the motive had been revealed, and the household was ready to bury its scandal beneath silence. And yet, Miss Marple did not resume her knitting with the serenity of completion. Her needles lay untouched in her lap, her eyes resting on the dim embers of the drawing-room fire. Something nagged at her, something too small and inconvenient for Craddock's satisfaction, but too insistent for her to ignore. She had learned long ago that evil rarely settled itself into such neat compartments. Human nature was more untidy than that. It was only when Elsie, still pale from her attack, came timidly into the room that the thread revealed itself. "Beg pardon, miss," she whispered, "but I thought you should know." Her ladyship asked me this morning to burn some old letters. She said they were nothing, only rubbish, but— The girl hesitated, biting her lip. They were sealed, miss, and the paper looked foreign. Miss Marple's blue eyes sharpened. "And did you burn them, Elsie?" "I couldn't bring myself to. I hid them in my apron instead. They're here." She drew out 2 charred-edged envelopes, half singed but intact. Miss Marple thanked her, her voice as gentle as if she had been handed a kitten. When she examined them, she saw at once the faded postmarks, Buenos Aires dated 30 years past. Inside, fragments of letters remained, written in a hand strong and elegant. The words spoke not only of love, but of promises, promises of inheritance, of trust, of recognition for a child born out of wedlock. Her pulse quickened. These were no ordinary tokens of a forgotten romance. They were legal in tone, almost binding. If they had ever been produced in court, the stranger's claim as Lady Bantry's son would have been undeniable, which meant Pritchard's devotion was only half the story. Someone else had more to lose. Miss Marple rose at once and went to Lady Bantry's chamber. She found her seated at the dressing table, staring into the mirror with eyes that seemed to see nothing. "Lady Bantry," Miss Marple said softly, "why did you ask Elsie to burn these?" She set the letters gently upon the table. For a long time, silence. Then Lady Bantry's hands tightened upon the wood. "Because they prove what I could never allow to be proved," she whispered. "Yes, he was my son. Yes, those letters would have given him claim. But don't you see? If the world had known, the estate would not have gone to my husband's line at all. It would have gone to him, and then, after his death, to others of his blood. Strangers, foreigners. Bantry House, lost forever. Miss Marple listened quietly, her heart heavy. "And so," she murmured, "you destroyed what he brought with him. You burned the rest. And Pritchard, he only did what you allowed him to believe was his duty." Lady Bantry's head bowed. "I never told him to kill, but when he came to me that afternoon saying the man was a liar, an impostor, I did not deny it. I let him believe what I wished to believe myself, that this house was mine to preserve. And when he acted, I let him. I am as guilty as he." It was a revelation that shifted everything once more. Pritchard's loyalty, twisted into violence, had been stoked by Lady Bantry's own silence. She had not wielded the weapon, but she had supplied the motive, the justification. The true mastermind had not been the butler's hand, but the lady's. Pride. When Miss Marple revealed this to Craddock, he was aghast. "But she's a widow, an old woman. You can't mean to suggest—" "I suggest only," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that justice is rarely as simple as one pair of hands. Pritchard killed, yes, but Lady Bantry buried the truth long before. She fed his devotion, she allowed his belief, and she guided his every act by refusing to speak. That, Inspector, is as much guilt as any blow." The inspector was torn between outrage and pity. To drag Lady Bantry before the courts would be ruin beyond measure. Yet to ignore, her role was to leave the truth unspoken. Miss Marple's voice was steady. "You may decide what is to be done, Inspector, but mark my words, there is more than one kind of prison. Lady Bantry will live out her days within walls far harsher than any jail, walls of memory and shame." That night, as Craddock prepared his report, Miss Marple sat once more by the fire. The house was silent, the storm outside long gone, but the air still held its weight. She whispered to herself, "In the end, it was not devotion alone, nor inheritance, nor shame. It was all of these tangled together. Love turned into pride, pride turned into silence, silence into murder. The case was closed, but the twist lingered. The guilty had been found, yet guilt itself was shared, and as Miss Marple knew too well, that was the cruelest revelation of all. That evil is never clean, never neat, but rooted in the small concessions of ordinary people who choose silence where they might have chosen truth. The morning after the storm, Bantry House lay under a pale sky, the lawns glittering with rain. Inspector Craddock sat at the breakfast table with papers spread before him, his face drawn in hard lines. Pritchard was in custody, his confession written in the inspector's firm hand. Yet Craddock's gaze was troubled. He knew, as Miss Marple, knew that the story was not so simple. Lady Bantry did not appear for breakfast. She remained upstairs, shutters closed, refusing to see anyone. It was Craddock who finally spoke the unease aloud. "The law will hang Pritchard. His words are plain enough, but I cannot shake the thought that he was only half the crime, and half a crime is no justice at all." Miss Marple, sitting opposite, folded her napkin with delicate precision. "You are quite right, Inspector. Pritchard struck the blow, yes, but his motive was fed, encouraged, even guided by her ladyship's silence. He believed himself righteous because she allowed him to believe it. She did not command the deed, but she permitted it, and in human nature that is nearly the same." Craddock frowned. "Yet we cannot charge a woman for failing to speak." "No," Miss Marple agreed softly, "but we can name the truth at least." By afternoon, the household was summoned once more into the drawing-room, Lady Bantry herself included. She appeared pale but composed, her pearls trembling faintly at her throat. Pritchard, brought under guard, stood rigid, defiant, even in chains. The servants clustered nervously at the edges. It was Miss Marple, not Craddock, who spoke. Her tone was calm, almost kindly, yet her words carried the clarity of a bell. "You have all wondered how such crimes could have unfolded beneath this roof. A locked room, a vanished photograph, a pressed violet, 2 sudden deaths. It seemed chaos, yet it was all of a piece if one only watched closely. The locked room, ah yes, so impossible yet so simple. The young man was killed swiftly, quietly, before he had the chance to resist. The door was then closed from within, not by him, but by Pritchard, who used the slender length of wire he always carried for the library. Shutters. He reached through the narrow gap, turned the key, and so sealed the illusion. No force, no break, merely a servant's trick, unnoticed by the rest. Pritchard's eyes narrowed, but he said nothing. The photograph turned slightly upon the mantel. A small thing, yet out of place in this house where nothing is ever left askew. That was no accident. Pritchard left it so at first, uncertain whether to remove it, hoping none would notice. But when I did, it vanished. That was his fear, his devotion. And the violet, gone from the inspector's very drawer. A flower cannot vanish of its own accord. It was stolen, burnt, destroyed, because it tied Lady Bantry to her past. And the letters, those letters nearly shared the same fate. Her ladyship asked Elsie to burn them, hoping the truth might smoulder to ash. But Elsie, bless her, could not quite bring herself to obey. Lady Bantry bowed her head, her lips pressed tight. And Arthur, Miss Marple went on, the boy so eager to please. He knew too much, though he did not understand it. So Pritchard silenced him. He thought himself protecting the house, protecting his lady. He even believed, in his twisted way, that he was protecting the memory of the master who had gone before. That is why he acted not out of hatred or greed, but devotion. Now she turned her gaze to Lady Bantry. But devotion does not grow alone, it must be nurtured, and it was your silence, your pride, your refusal to admit the truth that made Pritchard what he is. You let him believe he alone must guard the honor of Bantry House, and so he killed for it. The room was still. Even the rain beyond the windows seemed hushed. Pritchard's voice broke the silence, steady but dark. I would do it again. For her, for the house. I kept it safe when no one else would. Lady Bantry flinched as if struck, but she did not. Reply. Inspector Craddock cleared his throat, heavy with unease. The law will deal with him, that much is plain. Yes, Miss Marple said softly. The law will take him. But remember, the law cannot take what lies in the heart. Lady Bantry must live with her part in this. That is her sentence. The butler was led away, still proud, still unrepentant. Lady Bantry sank into her chair, her hands trembling. The tie. Servants dispersed, whispering that the house would never be the same again, and perhaps they were right. That evening, as the inspector prepared to depart, he lingered by the fire where Miss Marple sat with her knitting. You saw it all from the start, didn't you? He asked. She smiled faintly. Not all. Only the small things, the crooked frame, the missing flower, the look upon a face when a name was spoken. It is always the small things that tell you where to look. Human nature is so obliging, Inspector. It cannot help but reveal itself, if you are willing to watch. He shook his head in reluctant admiration. And so justice is done. Miss Marple's needles clicked softly. Justice of a kind. But there are always shadows left behind. Pritchard will hang. Lady Bantry will wither in silence. And the son who came seeking his place lies in the earth without a name. That is not tidy justice, Inspector. That is the sort the world gives. Us. The inspector left, and Bantry House sank into silence. Miss Marple, packing her knitting, looked once more toward the dark windows. The crime was solved, yes. But the unease would linger, as it always did, in the spaces where truth and silence had lived too long together. Bantry House did not return to peace when the case was closed. It settled instead into a kind of watchful quiet, the sort of silence that lingers after a storm when the branches still drip and the ground is sodden but the air is heavy, waiting. Pritchard was taken away under guard, his confession echoing still in the minds of those who had heard it. Lady Bantry withdrew further, shutting herself away behind curtains and hushed corridors. The servants spoke in whispers, unsure whether their loyalty lay with the lady, the house, or with their own survival. Miss Marple, for her part, walked the gravel paths one last time before leaving. The roses trembled in the damp air, their petals darkened by rain, and the gravel crunched faintly under her sensible shoes. She paused often, as though she were listening for something unspoken. Inspector Craddock, catching up with her before she departed, asked what weighed on her mind. "We've got him, madam. He confessed. The case is settled. What more troubles you?" Miss Marple smiled, that faint, knowing smile that seemed to hold more than it said. "Oh, Inspector, cases are never quite settled. Not really. You tie them up as best you can, but there are always threads left hanging. And it is those threads that catch one's eye." Craddock frowned. "What threads, then?" She hesitated, her gaze drifting back toward the house. "Did you notice the motorcar tracks, Inspector? They led in, but no one ever saw them lead." "Hout, and no motorcar was ever found," he scowled. "A detail. Perhaps Briggs was mistaken." "Perhaps," she murmured. "And yet the stranger did not walk here, of that I am certain. He had means, though we found none of them. Where then is that motorcar? Hidden, perhaps, somewhere nearby. Or driven away by another hand entirely, after the deed was done." Craddock said nothing, but his jaw tightened. He did not like mysteries that lingered. "And then," Miss Marple went on gently, "there is the matter of the letters. Elsie saved them, but there was one envelope half-burnt, its contents gone. One wonders what truth lay in that missing page. Something more binding, perhaps, than what we found. Something that frightened Lady Bantry enough to make her set them to the fire." Her eyes were steady, though soft. "We solved the murders, yes. But the story of the heir is unfinished. His father's name remains unspoken. His claim lies buried with him, and Bantry House will carry that silence long after we have gone." The inspector muttered that he was done with the place, and left her to her thoughts. That evening, Miss Marple boarded the small train that would carry her back to St. Mary Mead. She settled into her seat, folded her gloves in her lap, and watched. The countryside drift past. Villages, hedgerows, fields silvered with mist. She might have looked like any elderly woman returning home after a visit. Yet her mind ticked quietly, measuring each unanswered question. In the corner of her reticule lay a small thing she had taken, unnoticed, from the library before leaving. Not theft, merely preservation. It was the scorched scrap of linen she had found in the orangery, the one marked with soot. She had said little about it, for the larger crimes had overshadowed it, but she kept it nonetheless. And as the train rattled on, she turned it over in her fingers, for there, faint but visible, even through the burn, were initials embroidered in thread, L.B. Lady Bantry's own mark, from linens prepared for her youth. How it had found its way beneath Arthur's body in the orangery, she could not yet say. Perhaps it was nothing. Perhaps it meant everything. She folded it away again, her eyes twinkling faintly, as though at a secret joke. "Ah," she whispered. To herself, a mystery never ends. Not really. There is always another corner of the pattern yet to be revealed. And as the train carried her homeward through the soft English dusk, the quiet old lady who so often went unnoticed smiled into the window glass, already listening for the next whisper of human folly that would call her forth again.